This video is about the supercomputer and patterns, and this one is probably going to have a little bit more depth to it than the other one did. I planned on doing two of them, and this is the second one. Before I talk about the connection to the like the New York Stock Exchange computer, which I call the supercomputer, I want to define the patterns of how we find gaps up. In this video also, I'm just talking about gaps up. I'm not going to be talking about gaps down. And as a reminder, every pattern that we find has good conditions, but we love to find supporting evidence outside of the good conditions. Conditions come in poor, or bad, poor, and good. And the connection that we have to high probability next for the price moving in the anticipated direction the next day is what this formula is all about. Now, the three patterns that we see as a part of the best method that we have for finding gaps up is what is referred to as the one pattern. The down touch, specifically trend red, is best, but it can be trend green as well. Would down touch one of the three trio lines, the blue, pink, or yellow line, or zero. And anyway, the third one is proximity groups, and proximity groups is the power four: the pink, blue, and the white and yellow. Keep in mind, the power pink is a deep cycle indicator. It doesn't have the deep cycle depth that swing gray has as a deep cycle indicator, but it is still what we refer to as a deep cycle indicator. Gray goes deep more often than pink, but that's another video. Now, when you have those three patterns, the proximity group, the down touch group, and the identical indicator group, those three conditions are necessary for a gap up next day. That doesn't mean if you have all three, you're going to have a gap up next day. You could have a small green candle and then the following day have a big one. You could have a couple, three that are pretty nice. The emphasis is on you have to have those patterns in order for the thing to work, in order for the gap up to work. And the differences come in the definitions of a one pattern. For example, is the majority of the 22 market force recognition indicators are in one specific pattern, like a bottlenose pattern or a BOC higher pattern or whatever it might be. Now, you can have 12, which is the majority out of 22, or you can have 18 or 19. There's a big difference in what you have there in those extra 6 indicators, and it's called supporting evidence. When you have 18 or 19 indicators in identical pattern, it's obviously called a one pattern, but it also has, in itself, it has supporting evidence. If you had another pattern that had, let's say, 14 identical indicators, and then it had 4 indicators that were of a different pattern but still were part of a gap up pattern, then you would still have 14 identical indicators with 4 indicators in supporting evidence. So you might say additional conditions pointing up, or signals, whatever you want to call them. It's that you're now at 18 in both examples. The other aspect to this is the trend, the down touches. Trend red down touching trend pink is the best down touch you can have. Let me give you an example. You can have a trend red down touch with all indicators, all short-term trend indicators going down. Now, that may deter the gap from going up real high, and depending on the pattern that you have, it can have just the opposite effect, in that the gap would go up real high. And by that I mean if you had 18 TOC bottom patterns at the bottom, that is more powerful than some other patterns that we might have, like a BOC at the bottom, or it could be. Things are the 3 patterns, the one pattern, or let me say the identical pattern, the down touch pattern, and the proximity group pattern still will vary in the length of gap up that occurs based on the 7 the 7 short-term trend indicators and a few other conditions. There are certain conditions, depending on the pattern that we have, that we like to see other supporting evidence as conditions, and that magnifies the height of the gap. Proximity group patterns are defined as the power 4, that's the pink, the blue, the white, and the yellow, all above power orange. And there is a document that I put together about proximity group gap up patterns. Read that, make a copy of it. It lists 7 patterns that work when the proximity group is above the power orange line. One exception is when you have I think it's the last one of the 7 that I marked down. It's 3 days down. When you have 3 days down, the white and the blue, especially the blue, can be under the orange. When power Zion is under the orange, that's a better gap the next day, typically, than if it's above power orange. The other key thing is that, and you can recognize, you can search for it this way. I mean, there's so many ways to find these things. And that is that power green and power orange are close together. I would kind of use 0.15 as the maximum spread between green and orange. You've heard me comment about have the green and orange being close together when the gap takes place. I mean, I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of examples with gaps that are 0.0, 2, or 3. And obviously a lot more as you go up higher. That doesn't mean that if you've got a spread between the green and the orange, power green and orange, like 2.5 or excuse me, 0.25, the spread of it, that it's not going to gap up, because it more than likely will. It's just that there's a high, how do I say this? The majority of time when the gaps gap up, green and orange are close together. Again, most of the time they're above zero, but sometimes they're under zero, but they're always close to zero. When the green and the orange lines are close to zero when the gap up occurs. Now, there is another one that I'll just mention as long as I'm on this topic, and that is that the proximity group, those 7 patterns in the proximity group, there is another one, and it's a crossover pattern. So in other words, when the power 4 cross over orange and green, not just orange, but orange and green, at least this is the way I've seen it. I'm sure there's going to be some examples out there where they cross over, some cross over the orange but don't quite make it over the green. But in any case, what I've seen has been a crossover the orange and green. When they cross over green and orange, that qualifies as an 8th signal, but it doesn't happen very often when you have the other 2 patterns with it, the identical pattern group and the downtrend group, along with the proximity group, or those 3 together. Now, that being said, when the power 4 crosses over the power green and orange, it's typically a continuation pattern. So what I'm telling you here is that it's not like a gap where you have a next day up. It's like an uptrend where you have 2, 3, 5 days up. And obviously each day is itself, but you can see a lot of things just by, once you get that crossover, then you have a situation where each day as those 4 lines go up, the price will go up, and eventually one of them's not going to go up, and that's typically a signal for you to question where you're at, and you know, deal with your situation accordingly. Now, all that being said, we have the sensitive indicators, which is basically the indicator power in the 3 powers of the system: the indicator power, the formula power, and the procedures power. Now, when traders find out that we've got a system that deals with gaps, sometimes they get lost in, oh, I got to do gaps all the time. And that's not what this system is about, because there's so much more to it in the way of finding uptrends or downtrends or reversal patterns, etc. If you haven't heard it before, Day Trading Visual Basics is a reversal pattern identification system. There are 20-some patterns in the pattern types up, and there are 20-some patterns in the patterns type down. And so probably 45 total patterns, maybe 46 I should count. But as a result of that, they're all different patterns, and that's why you can identify the one. If you get a right leg W higher, that's an up pattern. You're not going to let me say, it is possible for you, if you're not looking at the good conditions and not working the system, it would be possible for you to get into a wrong position. You think you got a gap up and boom, it opens up and it's 9 cents away from the open or from the previous close. Well, obviously that's not a gap up. Now, with that being said, you make your own call on that. Personally, I normally get out immediately. If that, or let me say this, I would recommend that you get out immediately, just exit the position. And whether it gapped up 9 cents or gapped down 9 cents, I mean, you can stick around and see what it does the rest of the day, but be cognizant of the fact of the candle theory. It opens up, when it's a red candle, for example, it opens up, goes up, and then goes down all day, and then somewhere before the end of the day, it goes back up so that you have an upper and a lower tail on a red candle. That's the way, 9 times out of 10, the way a red candle is produced. Now that's valuable information when you're in a situation where you're anticipating that you have a gap up and it opens and goes up. Well, bingo. That's the I mean, there are exceptions. You can get flat bottom green candles. There's just so much demand or so much buying pressure in the market that it just opens, it's a flat, and it just keeps going up for the whole day. But you need to make that decision based on candle theory. If your response when it opens up is not what you anticipated. The same is true with a green candle. A green candle typically opens, whether it's up or down from the previous close, it doesn't make any difference. It opens and goes down, then goes up all day, and then at some point it starts coming back down and you end up with an upper tail and a lower tail on a green candle. Typically. I mean, we all know of you know, T-top dojis or other candle names that you can think of. Now, what's important to realize is that you always have conditions with different situations. And the reason you have these varied conditions is because you have different levels of market forces or market pressure that's going on in the stock at that particular point in time. Some people will tell you you can't read or you can't find the bottoms or the tops, don't even bother trying. And the guy that says that is lying, because you can definitely find the tops of cycles and the bottoms of cycles. It's real easy if you got the right indicators. I mean, we built 1,200 plus, maybe even up to, I never counted them totally, but I'm guessing up somewhere around 1,300 or 1,400 indicators. And we kept 22 market force indicators only. I mean, we have 40 total indicators, but you got 4 bands with an upper and a lower band on the candle chart, plus the master long-term trend chart. That's 9. And you got the 7 short-term trend lines. And then there are 2 trend lines, the swing gray, which is a deep cycle indicator. That's a special use indicator. But we don't track that as much in a market force recognition venue because it moves slower. The other one is swing blue, and swing blue is basically the crossover line with swing red and green, and red and green are the two short-term trend lines. Now, the other thing, when you're dealing with the trend chart, Trend red is the #1 indicator that we look at first off every examination, every verification, everything. It has a lot of influence and a lot of power in where it's at and what direction it's going. It tells us a whole lot. This is why the gap up patterns work best when trend red is down touching something. The trend red, if it down touches pink, the pink line has the greatest reaction to the down touch, because all of these patterns are reversal patterns. The red down touches and hits the pink, and keep in mind it can be 3-4 points above. It doesn't have to be exactly right on the line, and it can be under a little bit too, and it would still, in my mind, qualify for a down touch pink. But now you can have for example, there are 5 different down touches. The red can down touch the 3 trio lines, the blue, the pink, or the yellow. It can also down touch the 0 line, and then there's another great factor. It's kind of conditional, and that is trend red down touches under 0. So in other words, we say it spikes down under 0, but what you then also have is either trend green or trend gray is down touching some line above it, either 0 or one of the 3 trend lines. You can get gaps up with just the green trend line down touching one of those 5 situations. Typically the green line is not a gap under 0 scenario as a qualifying down touch, but red typically has something above it that also down touches when that happens. So now you relate a little bit to what these patterns and conditions and signals are all about as it relates to the gaps. The factors, like for example, you can get a high, when I say it has a high number of identical indicators, I'm typically saying that it has 18, 19, or 20. You know, I've seen several 21s. 21 indicators out of 22 are in an identical pattern. I've also seen, I don't think I've seen 20 or 21, but I've seen 16, 17, or 18 indicators identical with no gap. And no same direction anticipation either. You just had a stagnant market, you had a congestion market, or you had some kind of pressure that was slightly abnormal. It's just like I've recommended that you do not trade after a big gap down or a big gap up. And the reason is because these are very sensitive indicators. And when if you have a stock that gaps down $3 or $9 or whatever it is, the problem that you have is that you've thrown the market pressures out of sync with equilibrium. And standard deviation, conditions, or however you want to think about what's happening with equilibrium, when you have a big price movement overnight, that changes how the sensitive indicators react. In a big gap down, your sensitive indicators are going to typically respond and go up. That doesn't, or I should say the leading indicators. I mean, you can have the indicators after a big movement just doing something in the opposite direction of what you anticipate with the price. You know, maybe the indicators are going up and the price is going down for 5, 6, 7 days after a gap. So my recommendation is not to trade after a gap, because the sensitive indicators are basically too sensitive in their pickup as it relates with equilibrium and price movement. Now, whatever style of trading you are, whether you like red peaks or red spikes, those are one-day trades and you pick another one the next day. Some people like pink green tops or pink green bottoms, and those are very valuable patterns. But the next day in a pink green bottom, you can run into a red peak, into a red peak, which is an instant I'm going back down scenario. So you just have to watch at the end of every single day, or however you're doing it. Let that day count for itself. Don't assume that you can do a red, have a pink green bottom, and 5 days later you can look at the stock. That's not what this system is all about. We have the three powers. I mean, obviously the sensitive indicators are the heart of the system, and the formula power is the patterns and the conditions and the signals. And when you have good conditions with one of those pattern types up, you have a high probability situation, because basically you can take one of those patterns and think of it like this. 10 of them, you can take 10 patterns and look at 10 patterns. They're all identical in different stocks, and you want to pick one. Well, 2 of them are going to have, by example, I'm just saying, 2 of them are going to have real nice green candles. 4 or 5 are going to have small green candles, and the rest are going to be flat and possibly even a small red candle at the end of the day. So we want the candles, or excuse me, we want the patterns that have the good conditions that identify what the trade is going to do, and as a result of that, those 2 become high probability trades. We know with those good conditions that there is, and I mean very high. I'm not, you know, there are different ideas about high probability. Some people just think a majority, like 60% or something, but I'm talking very high. I mean 97, 98. It's really high when you just pick those movements that have the good conditions with one of those patterns that we have identified. We always use the patterns. We always look at the conditions. Sometimes there's a signal and sometimes there's not. Like, for example, when Zip Green and Zip Zion are buyers going in and out of the market, and those 2 lines track those indicators. Indicators, the Zip Zion is the grandfather, I like to say, of Zip Green. It needs more power to be at 100 and more power to be at 0. But when Zip Green and Zip Zion are at 100, there is a huge number of people coming into that stock. And vice versa, when they're both at 0, there is a huge number of people leaving that stock. And when Zip Zion is highest, all your other market force indicators are under it because they've reacted quickly to what's the pressure is being identified. And so ZIP Zion is highest, and there is no signal to say, okay, now enter the position. You're typically going to open up you might find the thing, you know, in the evening doing a little searching or something, or just looking at a chart, and you spot a ZIP Zion highest. It's best if it's over 50 so that it has room to go down. It can go up slightly and still have a red candle. Sometimes those red candles are in a congestion movement for one day, or rarely it goes up twice and is highest. It's usually going to go back down. And you just stay in that trade until the ZIP Zion line disappears under some other indicator lines. There's no signal to it, is what I'm alluding to here, except an exit signal. All right. Now, that being said, the supercomputer makes a decision based on something to gap up next day, or gap down, whatever it is. And we're using a gap up example. So how and why does it make that decision? What does it see? I mean, there isn't a guy at a desk making this decision. The computer recognizes something, and the stock opens up $3 or $5 higher overnight. With patterns and good conditions, we can recognize uptrend movements, or in the case of gaps up, when we have high identical indicator counts with trend red or green down touches, and with proximity groups in one of the 7 patterns, or even an 8th pattern. When we have those 3 conditions, we then can recognize a gap up situation. And what our sensitive indicators identify through the process, through this formula process of at least the patterns and the conditions. Not using the signals right now. We're just looking at the patterns and conditions. We can see a gap up next day. And so I say there's a supercomputer connection, because it's not like we're tied in with the supercomputer, because we're obviously not. But we're picking up on the same codes, or the same sensitive indicators, if you will, that when a decision is made by the supercomputer to do a gap up next day. That's the supercomputer connection, or the relationship between the supercomputer and the patterns. I have no other, I'm not trying to brag about this, I'm just trying to state this as a fact. There is no other logical explanation. I mean, we don't have some super algorithm that is going to do this. The whole emphasis of this entire system was to keep it simple, keep it basic. I was a beginner in 2007 when I made my first trade. I thought I had a system or a method, and I just thought that stock was going up, and I had not built even one indicator. And that was a trap I was in. And that's why many of these videos, or at least a strong handful of these videos, is trying to tell you about the system we have and the traps that we fall into, and don't see the traps. I mean, what's more important, the next trade you make or the system you use to find that next trade? Do you always trade high probability trades? We always do. When you pick one of those patterns, you're already in a high probability trade. You just need to find the pattern that has the good conditions with it. If you don't, You don't trade it. You don't pick it. In gaps, when you have those three patterns, the high indicator pattern, the trend down touch pattern, and the proximity pattern, with one of those 7 patterns of all 4 lines that's marked on that patterns group gap up document that I was talking about. When you have it's those 4 lines together that are all TOCs, or that are all BOCs, or they're all a 2-day TOC. What that means, it's the top of a cycle and the right leg is down 2 days. And there's the other shapes that I've drawn out on that proximity group gap up pattern sheet that I've hand drawn those particular patterns. When you I mean, this is a variety of stuff that's going on that puts the supporting evidence together. All you have to do is read it and find it. I mean, you can go to the radar screen. The 22 market force recognition indicators are set up when they find bottom of cycles, top of cycles, and all the rest, bottlenoses, all the rest of that stuff, right leg W's, high M patterns, and they're coded differently in a box color. I mean, it's exciting when you're looking at those 22 and you're scrolling down through 3 or 4 or 500 stocks that you're contemplating using or contemplating investigating, and boom, one of them has 18 or 19 of the same color. That's exciting. That doesn't mean it's going to be a gap up, though, but it definitely means that you're going to investigate it and see what it's going to do, because it could be an uptrend. And of course, if it has the 3 high indicator patterns with the trend down touch and the proximity group, then you're much closer to having a gap up pattern. And there aren't many that don't. I mean, I shouldn't say there's. You have to investigate yourself. You have to analyze what's there. As one of the best things you can do is go to the Excel, create a gaps up pattern, list your stocks, look at your hot lists and find gaps up, and then just plug those in and make 10 or 12 columns of different things out of them. One of them being the spread between the price, between the power green and the power orange. And you'll see that those gap ups, the spread is very small on all of them. And you'll see differences in the way in other things, in the way they react. You'll see how many gaps have the ZIP Zion under the, I said that wrong. You'll see how many gap ups have the power Zion under the power orange. And then the other 4 indicators are doing something up above the power orange. When Zion is under orange, that's a real key indicator condition, and it seems to be a strength of the up push, if you will. So I call it the pattern connection with the supercomputers. We're obviously not built like the supercomputers, but we do have sensitive indicators with good conditions that identify ahead before these gaps occur. So there's absolutely some kind of connection between whatever codes are are written inside the supercomputers, and as it relates to our patterns and good conditions. I don't know what it is, but I do know it's there. I can see it. I can enter a position prior to the gap up. I mean, nobody has got a system that finds gaps before the gap. Everything I've ever seen of anybody that talks about gap trading is they take the open, and 1 minute after the open, they pop on some indicator, or excuse me, some stock that has gapped way up or way down, and then they say, now let's trade it. It's got high volatility. That's not trading gaps. But we're excited about this system. I can't tell you the amazement that I have in how these things came together. I mean, I give God the credit. Somehow, you know, we spent a lot of hours doing things, but I'm amazed. And if you spend any time in this system at all, you will be amazed as well. Because it's the high probability conditions that we have are way out of the realm of normal high probability conditions. I mean, how do you get 99% of the time it occurs? All I can say is amazing.